markets. Yet, one truth remains. If workers are left out of trade policy, development will not be just sustainable or inclusive. The Trade Union Trade Talk series, therefore, was created to bridge the knowledge gap between the negotiation table and the factory floor, to equip trade unions with the tools, the evidence, and networks needed to influence trade policy in favor of decent work. Across the sessions, you would see that we aim to build capacity for trade unions or trade unionists to promote evidence-based advocacy on digital trade, food security, industrial policy, etc., to connect regional actors, researchers, policymakers, and unions through a shared platform for dialogue and action such as we are having. And ultimately, let us ensure that Africa trades, but does not trade away its workers. And therefore, the series is made through this visionary collaboration with the deep appreciation and support from ITUC-Africa leadership and affiliates. And Comrade Joel Akato Odije, General Secretary, extends his warm greetings to all our participants. We also thank SASC and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Finland for the continuous solidarity, and to especially you, our participants, whose engagement transforms discussion into action. Well, my name is Hod Anyigba, the Executive Director at ALREI and the Chief Economist at ITUC-Africa. I am going to be your moderator. Today's focus is both timely and urgent. The impacts of the Trump tariffs on African countries, implications for workers, and trade justice is the theme we have selected for today's discussion. Following the expiration of AGOA on September 30th, 2025, with a promise from the United States showing commitment for its extension, Africa exports to the United States now face a tougher tariff regime. From textiles to agriculture and metals, value chains are under pressure. Jobs, especially for women and youth, are at stake. Unions must therefore anticipate, analyze, and act. So this session we're going to have here will be a session to examine the resurgence of U.S. trade tariffs and its effects on across Africa, the real labor implications, strategic response from unions, governments, and how Africa can actually shift from a position of vulnerability to a bargaining power. And we have the right person to actually do that for us and set the tone. We are honored to host Colette van de Ven, founder and director of TULIP Consulting International. TULIP Consulting, it's an international, she's an international trade lawyer with more than 15 years of experience and a research fellow at the London School of Economics. She has advised many governments, published so many policy studies and on trade and sustainability. She has represented governments at the WTO and has featured in major news outlets, including the BBC, Financial Times, and what have you. She brings so much expertise, unparalleled expertise, to today's discussion. So let this TUTT series begin. And I will start by asking a very important question I'm sure our participants are yearning to hear. So, Colette, welcome to TUTT Series 3.
Thank you very much, Hod.
Why a trade war with the rest of the world and Africa caught up in the crossfire when the world, the global market, is already facing enormous economic and political turmoil? Why a trade war at this time from President Trump?
Thank you, Hod, and thank you for the introduction and for having me on this program. Um, well, I think all of these elements are connected, right? So I'm looking at it as more of the political, the economic, and the trade turmoil as being all part of the same package. And the context in which all of this is taking place is a global increased movement towards away from trade openness and multilateralism towards more protectionism, towards more nationalism, etc. And
De
why is
tendance
all
vers
of
le
this happening?
nationalisme au lieu
It's
d'ouverture de frontières.
important in
Et
numerous
pourquoi?
different developments, but one, of course, is the emergence of China and the competition that's created for so many countries. It's the US's focus. Especially from the Trump administration, that's looking at trade in a different way or in a different way than I think say the principles of the multilateral system are approaching trade. And this is by initially focusing on things like the trade deficit, right? The bilateral trade deficit between different countries, which was the initial basis on which the Trump administration calculated its first set of tariffs back in April. Um, and that in turn is linked to ideas about bringing back manufacturing in the US and the fact that trade has always had winners and losers. And under the Trump administration, there's been that focus to, for example, especially the industries that have been losing out to more competitive imports, say heavy industries or things like that, to bring some of that back into the United States, right? So all of these elements are connected. Um, and Africa, the African continent, as you say, Hod, is kind of caught in the middle. It wasn't the focus of this trade war, but because of especially initially the way in which some of these tariffs were calculated, you've seen some countries like Lesotho that initially had a 50%, right, 50, which was among the highest hit countries, basically being heavily hit. But that's been since revised when the new tariffs have been rolled out 90 days later. And right now, of course, there's also a go up. But on the global context, there are all these different elements playing a role. And what you also see is as a result, other countries also turning more nationalistic, right? Turning more inwards. You see much less appetite globally for multilateral processes. Here in Geneva, where I sit, in the World Trade Organization, there's an upcoming ministerial conference in Yaoundé in Cameroon next year. And commentators are not so optimistic as to what can be achieved realistically in that event. UNFCCC, you saw some challenges there as well. There are a lot of different issues there. So that's by and large creating the shift towards more nationalistic approaches, including also by other countries, not just United States, but that are following suit.
Thank you for that. And the quest for a certain global community to push for multilateralism, we have seen that from the recent G20 and how all countries have come together, and still issued a statement of commitment to most of the multilateral
Mhm.
commitment without the United States, and that was quite interesting. Um, but let me take you on to a certain economic intelligence question. I mean, trade shocks usually hit sectors asymmetrically. Studies from China, studies from even Africa show employment declines where industries are exposed to tariff volatility. So, Africa, if you think about it, may face a Trump shock, particularly in AGOA dependent sectors, like we have seen in a country like Lesotho, where a lot of workers are facing this Trump shock, right? And so, if you think about it from that sectorial employment shift theory, the famous Tompler-Samuelson theorem, trade shocks affect wages and employment differently across sectors. Now, how have the Trump tariffs affected African exports, in your opinion, and jobs in key sectors such as textiles, steel, and agriculture, and perhaps would continue to impact these sectors? What
Mhm.
is your expert view?
Yeah, thank you, Hod. I think that's a really key question as well. So perhaps to start by breaking it down a little bit, what all the elements are that we're looking at, and then how this is impacting different sectors. So, First, we're looking at the Trump tariffs, right? And those were initially announced in April, subsequently revised, right? And a lot of African countries that were really heavily hit, like Lesotho with 50 or Madagascar at 47, they were revised down quite a bit, right? So Lesotho today, under that package of tariffs, has been revised to 15%, and a large number of African countries are at 15, some are at 10, South Africa is at 30, right? So the first element to look at is to identify the right set of facts that we're looking at. And that in order to get to your analysis, right, of what sectors are most affected. And that is already being quite a challenge because of these frequent shifts in announcements, right? There is a certain degree here of instability and of uncertainty. And I think that first and foremost is what's made this particular set of tariffs extremely challenging to respond to, both for governments and industry. You see that in particular in the Lesotho case, right? Even if the tariffs of 50% have subsequently been revised down to 15%, a lot of the damage has already been done, right? Companies have laid off workers. Companies have orders have been reduced, even if the 50% did not materialize, right? So number one of all of this is the uncertainty around what's happening and how that's impacting the responses, right? But now we take the tariffs that were subsequently revised and let's build on those because that's what we've got, right? In addition to that package of tariffs, you rightfully point out, Hod, that there is the expiration of AGOA, right? The African Growth and Opportunity Act. And under AGOA, the United States provided duty-free access to the United States market for a large range of products. There were, I think, over 6,000 products. And that allowed and enabled numerous industries to get a competitive advantage, a competitive edge over other countries exporting similar products to the United States, but that were not eligible for AGOA, right? So this basically, the zero tariff really was an enabler. It was devised under the Clinton administration as a trade enabler, trade, not aid in that philosophy. Now that program has expired, as you've pointed out, in September, right? So just a few months ago, it expired. Because there was no support at the time to keep that going. Just as a caveat before we go into the sectoral analysis, there is right now, from what I've read, some bipartisan support in the United States Congress to potentially prolong that or reinstate that program with 1 year. So again, some element of uncertainty here as to what's actually happening also on AGOA, right? And are we having this analysis today that will have to be revised altogether because of something that will happen tomorrow, right? So just that element of uncertainty remains there, including in the AGOA analysis. But let's add up everything that we know today, and there, which sectors are affected and which ones are more prone to being affected than others. Now, the sectors that are mostly affected from the totality of the package and how one can look at that is from the studies that have been done, it's predominantly the textile and garment industry. That one is slated to be to having the highest exposure, and it's estimated, this is ITC research at International Trade Center, to reduce projected exports of AGOA beneficiaries in total by 8% by 2029, of which the vast majority is in the in the apparel sector, and then followed by skins, leather products, and footwear, and then processed food and animal feeds and vehicles. Why is apparel most heavily affected? This is directly connected to the preference margin that apparel products were receiving under AGOA, in addition to the tariffs that we're seeing. But if we take the AGOA package, most favored nations tariffs for apparel tend to be quite high, right? They tend to range between, say, 8 and 10, 8 and 11%. Under AGOA, you get zero, right? So now that AGOA has expired, you're back to paying the MFN tariff, right, of whatever that is, 8 to 11%. So that is why there is a huge impact from having no longer the AGOA tariff plus having to pay the new reciprocal tariff, right? Because those get added up, right? that impact is therefore so very significant in the garment industry. Agricultural and food products are also significantly impacted, not as much as textiles because the margin differential is lower. But those products come in here as well. And then products that would be and they put jobs on the line, right? Even the threatened tariff, as I've mentioned, but these existing tariffs as well. Another element to look at to identify who is impacted and who isn't. There is a sectoral element, but there's also the country-specific element, right? So some countries producing garments are more heavily impacted by this than others, and that is a factor not only of the exact tariff that the country has, in addition to the AGOA program expiration, but it's also a product of relative competitive disadvantage and advantages, right? So if you are directly directly competing with, say, Bangladesh as a garment exporter, in order to better understand how much all of these different tariff developments are impacting your competitiveness, you would have to not just look at what's happening within your own country, but how it compares vis-a-vis the situation of directly competitive products. So that would include looking beyond Africa as well, right? Looking at Bangladesh, looking at Vietnam, looking at the tariffs that they have been given, and any preferential programs that they're subject to under free trade agreements, right? Projects, there are also some elements. You mentioned the steel sector as well, Hod. Steel is not as heavily impacted generally from Africa, although there is a 25% tariff in addition to what the tariff is the country will be paying, right? So the only country whose steel exports will be significantly impacted is South Africa, right? Because South Africa is actually exporting, a sizable volume of steel, and they will have that added tariff that they would not have to pay, right? The 25 plus the 30. So that makes this disadvantage for South Africa. But a lot of other African countries are not as heavily reliant on steel exports to the United
Mm.
States. So there, the shock will be less. Another point I wanted to make just in this discussion is that one sector that's exempt from the Trump tariffs, those are mostly critical raw materials, right? That's not always highlighted as much. But that means there's a long list of things in the original tariff announcement of what critical raw materials are exempt from the Trump reciprocal tariffs, right? A lot of these critical raw materials are not that impacted by the AGOA expiry because the differential with the MFN tariffs tend to be very low on those, right? So the differential between no AGOA and MFN is low. So those countries are potentially not as affected by the cumulative effect of the tariff changes that we see, right? And what that also means is that those countries will continue to be competitive in exporting commodities, right? Which has traditionally been a key problem of the African continent because it moves away from product diversification, right? So that element is also there. And then finally, just to conclude on some of these shifts in competitiveness, what's important as well is in understanding how everything changes, some countries are standing to gain, right? It's not a loss across the board. Who is standing to gain? And this goes back to my earlier point. It's those countries that comparatively are coming out of this in a better position. So take, for example, Ethiopia, right? Ethiopia had its AGOA preferences revoked a couple of years ago because of human rights violations and a few other things, right? So they were not benefiting from the AGOA preferences and hence could not be, were not eligible to export say garments to the United States at zero tariff. Now, for a place like Ethiopia, the fact that other countries are no longer able to do that either is actually, on balance, creating a situation that could benefit them competitively, right? So that's also important to highlight, or even take Ethiopia on a different product. Take coffee, right? Ethiopia has 10% tariff, Brazil has 50, right? That is a coffee export competitor. So that will also influence the game. So a lot of who gains and who wins, yes, it's sectoral, and sectorally the sectors that are losing out is garments, it's agri-food processing, it's the ones that are connected with large number of workers, right? And a lot of workers that are in very vulnerable positions. The sectors that
mm,
tend to not lose as much are the raw materials and things like that. But
mm,
then there's also the country-specific situation, which depends on
mm.
a lot of other variables.
Interesting. This reminds me of the game theory. It's all a zero-sum game, isn't it? Somebody gains, somebody loses. But then you talk about something. There are jobs on the line in these sectors: the textiles, the food, is it the steel, the vehicles. Um, African Union launched last year, I think in October, the Africa Green Mining Strategy. And that seeks to say the value must be retained on the continent. So the critical raw materials Africa wants to keep on the continent,
Yeah.
and so it's not falling into that cycle of exporting raw materials all the time. But of course, like you have explained, you talked about uncertainty, uncertainty, uncertainty. You mentioned that a lot. Um, Tariffs from the Trump administration or from elsewhere not only triggers price, it changes the structures of the economy of specifically the labor markets. It affects women, it affects the youth, it affects low-skilled workers disproportionately, right? This is linked to the dual labor market theory. So what are the biggest risks in these shifts that we are going to see? What are the biggest risks you think you can identify with these big tariff movements? These risks that pose significant problems for African workers and industries, both in the short term and the long term. You have mentioned a few, but answering this question directly, what do you think will be the biggest risks that come to mind?
No, absolutely. I think the biggest risks are for the most vulnerable countries that are most heavily and strongly dependent on both the tariffs as a competitive advantage vis-a-vis other countries and the US market, right? So, and again, we get to Lesotho here, which is a country whose entire garment industry has been supported by these trade preferences, right? Without the trade preferences, the Lesotho garment industry would not exist the way it exists today, right? So when you take that away, that is when you really see a significant shock that is occurring, right? And significant risk for the workers. Um, Compare that to communities that have certain sectors but are not exclusively reliant on it. Say, communities that are also exporting the garments significantly to the EU market, or that are, in addition to doing garments, also having other industries that are creating a more diverse export basket. Right? Those countries are better positioned to withstand and to capture some of the shocks that happen because of these shifts. So I think the most vulnerable amongst the countries are really the smaller export dependent ones. And that depends also a bit on which sector. Lesotho garments is, I believe it's about almost 80 or 90% of their full export basket, if I'm not mistaken. It's enormous, right? So that creates enormous vulnerability. So it's that vulnerability element that needs to be looked at in order to identify where some of the biggest shocks are. Because the moment then a country is hit by tariffs, it can actually wipe out the industry, and it will actually result in enormous layoffs and all the socioeconomic consequences associated with that, which you've already seen in those countries, right? But I think it gets to you mentioned women and youth. Yes, they're disproportionately affected by this because of the industries, right, that are so reliant on the tariffs, like textiles. That's mostly our clothes are mostly stitched by women, right, in those factories. So those are, I think, some particularly vulnerable industries and communities. Um, and the vulnerability is very much dependent on the diversification and the reliance on some of these industries. I think another risk which isn't getting as much attention is the risk for the African continent of being flooded by products from other countries that were originally destined to the United States, but are now looking for other markets because of the tariffs that also other countries are trying to absorb, right, in other ways. So there is a risk that there is an increased influx of products coming into the African continent from elsewhere, and that could undermine competitiveness and nascent industries in the continent, right? And therefore further have implications for unemployment. So that I think is also really critical, and the fact that some of this is in particular impacting labor-intensive sectors, right? I mean, we talked about apparel quite a bit, but also agriculture, right? Which is very prone to that, makes this really, really a risk. I think a lot of that is short term. Long term, circling back to something that I've mentioned also earlier, is the risk that this creates a setback in terms of the African continent's industrial diversification project, right? Because of how it uh, doesn't impact the raw material exports as much, but it's predominantly really having an impact on the labor-intensive manufacturing sector, right? So that doesn't align the stars to have that boost of African manufacturing and enhancing African manufacturing exports further. So that I think is a long-term risk, especially going back to the labor elements, right? If you're exporting raw materials, it doesn't create the opportunity to add as much in terms of value added labor intensive jobs, local value and things like that, right? Um, a connected point there, I would say, and perhaps it's something you want to bring up later, but I may just mention it here, Hod, but is that I think it points to the importance of very proactive industrial policy in the continent linked to trade policy, right? And really from a long-term perspective, because, and this goes, if we take the garment industry as an example, part of the issue here, of these tariffs and the dependency on the tariffs is the fact that the reason a lot of these industries exist in the places where they exist in Africa in the first place is because of those tariff reductions and those preference programs. And while this can be a great enabler, right? And AGOA is a great enabler to create industry and workers and development. In reality, what you see is not as many domestic ties and linkages in these programs, right? You have a special economic zone where you have a company, often foreign owned, that brings in workers, often from outside, also hires African workers, but not exclusively, uh, and that basically imports fabric, typically from China, which is around, say, 70% of a total product's value, then does the manufacturing in the special economic zone in the African country, and then re-exports that under the preferential tariff to, say, the United States or the EU, right? So the actual local value added of all of that isn't all that much if you think about it, right? Because it's a foreign company, often foreign workers are involved, and there's limited linkages to the domestic economy because it takes place in a special economic zone, right? Which by definition limits some of these interactions. So there's an opportunity here to think about, I think, at a more industrial policy type level for governments to think about how can we use whatever we have in terms of trade opportunities as a lever to get a foot in the door, but then not leave it there and be much more proactive about how to create value added for the African workers in that industry, right? So that also when something changes on the tariff side, the industry has something to offer other than the preferential program and the access to those reduced tariffs.
You have mentioned some very interesting things. One thing that caught my mind was about the flooding of products from different part of the
Mhm,
world because of their comparative or competitive advantage, and even dumping is possible,
mhm,
on the continent, and that, of course, it's a point of worry. We should be careful, and you have advised us clearly, and even given us some key ideas of what governments can do. And I pretty much agree with the idea of the industrial policy, because I mean the classic labor response or responses are no longer enough. We must move from that protection policies to anticipating models, and we have at the ITUC Africa been thinking about even the just transition frameworks,
Hmm.
that can protect workers and move workers to reposition this value chains. Um, and so let me take you to what Africa can do, right? In Africa, we have this proverb that when two elephants fight, it is the grass that suffers. Not to say Africa is the grass here, but obviously Africa is bearing the brunt of China, US, trade wars, and it's affecting everybody, including Europe and Latin America and everybody. But then obviously there is an opportunity for collective bargaining power. We have the Africa Continental Free Trade Area Agreement. So how can they after strengthening African collective bargaining power, how can uh, advisors, how can it reduce this
Est-ce que ces
dependence
aspects
on
peuvent réduire
unilateral trade
cette
preferences?
dépendance
Today,
sur
there's
les
AGOA.
préférences unilatérales en termes de commerce?
Tomorrow,
Aujourd'hui, il y a la Goa.
certain gateway through different approaches. Tomorrow, and another day, it is a Chinese Belt and Road with not much of a say from the continent in terms of collective bargaining power. How can AFTA be used as a springboard to change the dynamics of trade for Africa?
Yeah, no, thank you for that question. Uh, there's there's a lot to unpack there, I think. So I think y your starting point of the bargaining power, right? This goes also, I think, at some other elements about like what can be done here, right? More generally, how can African countries position themselves vis-a-vis the current situation? And here, I think your question links to, you know, interacting with, say, in this case, the Trump administration or other countries, right, to collectively be stronger in seeking certain results that are in the best, aligned with the best outcomes for Africa. Um, I think on the AFCFTA, well, the AFCFTA, of course, represents a huge variety of countries, right? It's all of Africa, and that is not always easy. I once sat into one of the negotiation rounds many years ago, and I was reminded just how complicated it was for the African countries, with all the differences from language to priorities through different levels of development, and different resource endowments and what have you, to actually come together. And so what an achievement it is to have the AFCFTA, right? That's come out of a continent that is also highly diverse. So in terms of using the AFCFTA as a bargaining chip, my opinion there is that I think it might be too big a block, right, to do that, especially directly in negotiations. I think it's going to be quite challenging. I think it might be an alternative way to do this, to group together and to have more influence by having a grouped or coalition, would be by looking at aligned, like-minded countries within Africa that have, for example, sectoral interests that are aligned, like around, we talked about textiles and apparel as a majorly hit sector. That might be a way to create a coalition and say, let's all get together and collectively bargain for something that we need here. Or another way could be for resource intensive countries to come together, right? There was a meeting that the Trump administration put together with a handful of unusual, I guess, or smaller African countries. This was, I think, back in June or July. And those were all aligned in the fact that they had enormous amounts of natural resources. So there seems some appetite for some meetings along, I think, common elements there, and potentially also common interests. So I think, or different regional blocks, like the regional economic communities, might be another way to go about this. But going back to the AFCFTA, because I think the AFCFTA is, of course, a game changer for Africa in many ways, and plays an important role in the discussion that we're having, right? I think more generally, in particular, because I think it's about it represents a market of 1.4 billion and a combined 3.4 trillion in GDP. And based on the research, the AFCFTA if you trade amongst African countries, the value added of your trade tends to be higher than when you export outside of the African continent, right? So there is that potential as well, which is a key motivator of the AFCFTA. Now, I know that there's quite a few commentators and experts that have basically also suggested the AFCFTA can absorb some of the trade shocks, right? That is being created by the Trump tariffs, and it might be the push that's needed to get this over the finish line because there's still pending rules of origin and there's still some pending schedules of concessions and what have you, right? And trade under the AFCFTA hasn't quite picked up very much. So there is a whole array of literature around saying this could be the opportunity for the AFCFTA. I think that could be the case. And at the same time, I also think it will be in reality quite challenging, and that it will be quite challenging for the AFCFTA to absorb the trade gap that's been created by the US's tariffs. And I think that's in part because the African countries, I don't think, are directly able to absorb all of that additional trade flow, right? That would have to be redirected because you need to have a demand for that, and the demand isn't always there. There needs to be, ability to get similar types of prices for the products, which may also not be there. So one needs to have a look at the economics of this, right? Beyond the theoretical idea that this could happen, to see how realistic is it for the AFCFTA to actually absorb some of that excess, or be a place to which that trade can be reabsorbed. For some countries, they might be able to do it, especially the bigger ones like South Africa, etc., Nigeria. They might have more chances to sell their finished products on the African continent than some of the, especially perhaps the smaller countries. But I think another element here is that, again, the African continent will be competing with possibly increased influx of imports created by other countries also looking for alternative markets, right? Which could in fact undermine some of the inter-African, trade project that's being created. And I think finally, the question about creating intra-African value chains, and you've mentioned this with your reference to the mining agreement as well, Hod, and sustainability. And of course, one of the premises around this project being that there should be more value created within Africa for Africans by Africans, right? And to have more of the processing of different value chains happening within the continent. So that will not materialize automatically, right? So the AFCFTA can be a lever, can give a push for that, but it needs to be complemented with financing that's going into developing these value chains, research around where there are the right competitive and comparative advantages, access to different corridors, ports, logistics, prices of energy. All of these different things have to be aligned. So I think the AFCFTA can serve many different purposes, and I'm a huge fan. But its materialization won't be automatic, especially as an absorber, in the context of how much it can absorb of the trade excess, and also how much of the AFCFTA can be the focus of a coalition around negotiation. In terms of where Africans have their priority interests.
Good. I mean, you ended with the coalition. Now we hear of the coalition of the willing. Maybe we should call this the coalition of African countries that want to negotiate sectorally. It's a really, grand idea. And I'm sure we will take this to our governments and see how this can materialize. Comrades, if you joined us midway, we have been talking to Colette. She is a graduate of Harvard Business School. She earned her JD from there, and then
It's
also
the law school, not the business school, in case I'm getting
not a
any
business.
business questions.
So I'm only prepping my participants here to bring in the hot questions to you after I'm done asking a few more questions. So comrades, feel free to type your questions in the chat box. Because of time, we will not be opening the lines. We would want you to just send your comments or your questions in the chat so we can have as many as possible. All right, let's move on a little bit now into more discussions on after actually, but specifically around food. Um, the statistics around food is staggering for Africa. Africa imports over 60 billion of food, annually. Much of it from outside the continent, from the small shop across the streets. For me here in Togo, I can find grapes from Greece. I can find oranges from Spain, right? But oranges grow in Africa. What is going on? So for decades, Africa's food systems have been viewed through a humanitarian lens, framed around food aid, emergency relief, external dependencies growing from time to time. Now, in the book, How Africa Eats, and you have been working with David Luke on these things, you have a chapter in these books. I like the other one on How Africa Trades. Arguing for a shift, you argue for a certain shift, the book says. We must move from that shift to have that food security so that we have that economic progress that that society should be proud of. Of course, this aligns with the structuralist economists, which emphasize regional production, local linkages, etc. Now, my question here is, which provisions in the AFTA, looking at all these barrage of tariffs from the Trump administration and all the EPA agreements that we have signed that have not been working for years, and the Bretton Woods institutions emphasis on austerity that do not grow our economies when we go for loans. How can AFTA and other programs, if you like, how can we ensure food security for the working class?
That's a really large question, I think, Hod, and you're tying together a lot of different elements there. I would say first, everyone read the book, right? It's called How Africa Eats. It's not a cookbook. Uh, it's it's about food security and the African continent, which I think has some really excellent chapters. From that are looking at the bigger picture of why there is that food dependency element in the continent. How did that